Hi everyone. I hope everyone's enjoying their rainy day off. Don't worry, we're not going to be missing a whole lot by missing class today, especially since I'm doing this. Previously, we had planned to begin our section on syntax today, but I think it would be better if we reviewed or supplemented what we had previously lectured upon. Based on what I saw on your guys' homework, there were some things that I felt I had to go over. So today is going to be a supplemental lecture, and I'm basically going to be going over aspect and tense, which we didn't really discuss before, and then I'm just going to have a quick note on what constitutes an infix and how infixes differ from prefixes and suffixes. So we'll start by talking about aspect versus tense. So everyone pretty much knows what tense is. You have the past tense, present tense, and future tense. But not everyone has been taught what aspect is. It's a little bit different, and it kind of reflects an event's temporal flow from the point of view of the speaker. And this is regardless of whether it happened in the past, present, or future. So aspect is just, it's separate from tense, but goes along with tense. And we'll kind of clarify what we mean by temporal flow as we describe the different aspects. So the first aspect I'm going to talk about might not make a lot of sense at first, and we'll come back to it after we've discussed the other ones. I wanted to discuss this one first because it's it's the simplest. It's called the simple aspect. So it covers no particular span of time other than what is implied by its tense. So the temporal flow is unknown or unimportant to what the speaker is trying to convey. So you have the simple past, I walked to school. So simple present, I walk to school, walk is the present, and I will walk to school is the future. Simple future. So although it's reflected by tense whether the event happens in the past or the present or the future, the aspect doesn't reflect a discrete beginning or end of the event. There's nothing more conveyed but whether the event happened in the past, as in I walked to school, whether it happens in the present, I walk to school, or it will happen in the future, I will walk to school. So there's no real aspect being conveyed here by these sentences. Now notice in English, tense is reflected morphologically in the verb for past and present. So you have the ed morpheme reflecting past. And for the present, we have the S marking the present. Now here it's in the first person, so the S doesn't come up, but he, she, it walks, right? But for the first person, I walk, and for the second person, you walk. Now for future, notice that you have the added auxiliary, will, and that's what marks the future tense in English. So it's not marked on the verb, it's with this added auxiliary. Moving on to perfect aspect. Now, this aspect expresses completion of the event within the timeline. So whether it happened in the past, present, or future, it has this notion of completion. The process isn't ongoing, and it has a discrete endpoint. So past perfect, I had walked to school. It has this notion of completion, I had walked. Present perfect, I have walked to school. Now, even though this might seem like past tense, it's not. Notice have is present, right? So saying I have walked to school is kind of like conveying this fact that is currently true, right? So it's not so much the walking that you're saying is in the present, but this notion of I have walked to school. Future perfect, I will have walked to school. Now again, walked here has the ed, which you might associate with the past tense. However, you're saying I will have walked. So in some future point in time, I will have walked to school. So in English, if you notice, the perfective aspect, which has this notion of completion, is marked by the verbal morpheme ed. And then the tense is actually reflected in the auxiliary. So for past perfect, you have the ed, which is going to be associated with the perfect. However, it's only associated with the perfect if you have this auxiliary in front of it. Now, if it's not accompanied by the auxiliary and you're just saying, I walked to school, of course, that's going to be past tense, and it's going to be a simple past. So for past perfect, you have this auxiliary, and you notice it's conjugated into the past, had. So had walked, so past perfect. So for the present perfect, you have, which is present. So, and then you have the ed for the perfective aspect. So that's going to be the present perfect. Now, then for future perfect, we have will have walked. So will have is future. And then walk has the ed that marks the perfective aspect. So that's going to be future perfect. So in summation, when you have this verb that's just by itself with no auxiliary and it has an ed, that's going to be the simple past. I walked to school. However, if you have like have or will have or had, that presence of an auxiliary is telling you that there's something more going on there, and that you should treat those auxiliaries as marking the tense, and then the ed on the verb as marking the aspect, in this case the perfective aspect with the ed. Now notice also that in English we do have irregular verbs, so it's not always going to be that they have ed on it. So for example, to go, which is the infinitive for go, you're not going to have goed, right? You're going to have gone. I had gone to school. I have gone to school. I will have gone to school. So just keep that in mind, that there are irregular verbs, and so this ed morpheme isn't always going to surface. But for all the regular verbs that are conjugated that way, it's going to be the case. Okay, and now we're going to talk about the progressive aspect. So the progressive aspect expresses this ongoing and incomplete event with respect to whatever time you're talking about, the past, the present, or the future. So with the past progressive, if you notice, you see this auxiliary again surfacing like we saw in the perfect aspect, but instead of the ed morpheme that's placed on the end, you now have this ing, which is marking the progressive. So just like with the perfect aspect, you're going to refer to the auxiliary to find out what the tense is, and then the ing morpheme is telling you that it's progressive, meaning that it's ongoing and it's an incomplete event. So walking kind of conveys this ongoing event. I was walking. So in I was walking, was is telling you that it's past, and the ing on walking is telling you that it's progressive, it's ongoing. I was walking. Present progressive, now you see I am walking. Am is present, and then the ing on walking tells you that it's ongoing, and it's progressive. I am walking. Future progressive. I will be walking. Now in this case, will be reflects the future tense, and the ing morpheme on walk, making walking, makes it progressive. So again, just to reiterate, the progressive in English is marked by the verbal morpheme ing, and then the tense is reflected in the auxiliary verbs. So in this case, to be, was, am, and will be. All right, now let's talk about the perfect progressive aspect. Now this is where things might get a little bit funky, so don't worry if you don't get it at first, but you will. So this aspect reflects an ongoing event with a clear endpoint. So It's, as you might see, it's an amalgam of the perfect and the progressive aspect, which is why it has its name, the perfect progressive aspect. So the perfect aspect, if you recall, has a clear endpoint, and the progressive aspect reflects this ongoing event. So this aspect has both. So now look to the past perfect progressive example I have here. I had been working. So for the tense, you look at the auxiliary, which is here, it's had. It's in the past, so you have the past tense. And then for the perfect, you look at the next verb, which is to be, and it is conjugated for the past. So if you had a regular verb here, you would see the ed morpheme, but to be is an irregular verb, so you don't get the ed. It's been. So that reflects some sort of endpoint, right? So that's going to reflect perfect aspect. But then you have another verb, and it's working. Now, work has the morpheme ing, which reflects the progressive aspect. So it's going to be the perfect progressive aspect with the past tense on it. So, okay, let's talk about how something is ongoing and yet has an endpoint. Now, when you're narrating a story, you might use this tense and aspect. I had been working for 2 hours when something happened. So you're calling your attention to a point in time, in this case the past, where it's true that you had been working. And you had been working continuously up until that point. Now, it's not to say that you necessarily stop that action that you're doing, in this case working. You're just drawing your attention to a point in time where it's true that you were doing this thing and you were doing it continuously. Now, if you look at the present perfect progressive, I have been working. Same thing. You have your tense reflected in your auxiliary, which have is present. And then you have the past tense of to be, which reflects the perfective aspect, something ending. And then you have your progressive ing on working. Now you look to future perfect progressive. Will have is future, so that's where you get your tense. The past tense of to be, been, reflects the perfective aspect. And then the ing on work reflects the progressive, something that's ongoing. So now look to this example, I have been working for 2 years. Now when you say that, it's not necessarily true that you're quitting after saying that. I have been working for 2 years. So there's not really a real endpoint in the action of working. However, you're drawing attention to the fact that at this moment in time, it has been true that I have been working for 2 years. So there is this notion of an endpoint that you're drawing your attention to, but not saying that that action is necessarily going to end by saying that's an endpoint. And I hope I make that clear. It's kind of hard to describe. Okay, so now that we understand what tense and aspect are, we can go back and look at some of our homework questions that required us to know this stuff. So if you look at number 36 on page 188 of your book, which was assigned for homework, we can go back and correct some of our mistakes that many of us did. So this problem set gives you a very small data set of words in the Isleta language. It gives you 6 words, and then you're supposed to pick out the morphemes corresponding to different words and also tense and aspect. So I went ahead and filled in the ones for the lexical items, the words, which most of you got right because, it's pretty easy. However, with the tense and aspect morphemes, since many of you didn't know what these things meant, you got them mixed up. So let's go over them now. So for the lexical items, we have te for I, for you, me for he, and then me also for go, so that's a homophone, and then wan for come. So now we can look at what the morphemes are for simple past, simple future, In the book, it just says past and future, but you can just assume they mean simple past and simple future. And then for the present progressive and past progressive. Now we know what the simple past is. It's just past tense without any real aspect. So we know that simple past is, for example, I went, you went in the data set here. So we look at what these words have in common, and we see that bon occurs in both sets. And we know that me refers to go, because both words refer to going. It's went here because it's past. And then we know that a refers to you and te refers to I. So bon, that just leaves a bon, which is the simple past. So we can go ahead and fill that in. And we have bon for simple past. And then moving on to the simple future. Now we can look for examples of that in the data set. And so we see I will come is an example. And looks like that's all we have for the simple future. So we look at what we have left in this particular word, because we've already marked up the other morphemes. We have te for I. So we know that te isn't involved in the simple future. And then we know that come is one. So te and one are accounted for, and that just leaves he. So he must be the simple future marker in this language. Okay, moving on to present progressive. So you're going to look for a auxiliary, which is in the present, and then the verb should have an ing for the progressive aspect. Okay, so we look and we see I am going. So am is in the present, so that's the tense. And then going has the ing, which marks the progressive. So we look to see if there's any other, and it looks like that's the only example of present progressive in this data. So we look at what we have left when we compare what morphemes we already know. So we know that te is I, and we know that me is go, so those are accounted for. And we have we left, so we must be the present progressive. So we put down we as present progressive. Okay, so last of all, we have the past progressive. So we look for examples that have the auxiliary in our English gloss as having the past tense. And then our verb should have the ing marking the progressive aspect. So we look for examples of that. And we see that we have one example that says that glosses to he was going. Was is in the past, and then ing on go makes the progressive. So once again, this is our only example, so we want to look at what we have left once we pick out the morphemes we already know. So we have two instances of me. One which means go, and then the other which means he. So that leaves us with what must be the past progressive marker, which is I, the AJ. So that should be it for this exercise, and I hope it makes a lot more sense now that I've gone over tense and aspect. Okay, last of all, I wanted to talk about affixes. Some of you guys got a little bit confused what constitutes an infix and how they differ from prefixes and suffixes. So prefixes, as we talked about, attach to the beginning of a word stem. And suffixes attach to the end of a word stem. Now infixes are inserted into a word stem. We don't really have these in English, but we do have a few that kind of pop up in informal English, and a popular example is the insertion of expletives into words, like putting fucking into words like abso-fucking-lutely. So you notice that this word gets inserted inside absolutely. And it's not coming right before or after this word. So that's kind of what an infix does, right? It goes inside of the stem rather than on either side of it. So some of you got a little confused because prefixes and suffixes can pile on and attach to one another. But that doesn't change the fact that they're prefixes and suffixes. It might look like they're not, at the very beginning or end of the word, but they're still attaching before or after the stem. So one popular example is this long word that has a bunch of prefixes and suffixes, anti-disestablishmentarianism. So it has the prefixes anti and dis. So anti attaches to the prefix dis. And then it has 3 suffixes, ment, arian, and ism. So ment attaches directly to the stem, and then arian attaches to ment, and then ism attaches to arian. So some of you were thinking that because the affixes such as ment and dis aren't at the very beginning or end of the word, it looked like they were more in the middle of the word, but it's more contingent upon whether or not these affixes are attaching to, within the stem word or on the left or the right of it. So if it's on the left or the right of it, even if it's not directly attached to it or directly at the beginning or the end of the entire word, it's still a prefix or a suffix. In order to be an infix, it has to be inside the stem, like that funny little example I gave earlier. Okay, and finally, a little clarification on derivational affixes. Some of you were concerned that you couldn't pick out derivational affixes because you don't know their meanings. But even if you're unsure of an affix's semantic content and you think it's a derivational affix, you can determine whether it is derivational by seeing if attaching that affix to a stem changes its meaning. So, for example, we have that stir suffix in one of our homework examples, and that was a suffix that attaches to gang, making it gangster. Now, not everyone knows what stir means. I mean, you might guess, but no, you might not know for sure. But you know what gang means, and you know what gangster means. Are they the same thing? No. One is a collective of people. It's a gang. And then a gangster is one who belongs to that gang. So do they mean the same? No, they don't. But you might want to compare it to gang and gangs, which they pretty much have the same meaning. One is singular and the other is plural. But the ganginess of both words are the same. So stir must be derivational even if you don't know exactly what that stir suffix means. It carries some sort of semantic content. It must, because it changes the word's meaning when you affix the suffix to gang. And if you're interested in the meaning of affixes, you can actually navigate to this little link that I put here, and it's pretty interesting. It has a bunch of English morphemes, and it's separated by suffix and prefix. And it also has some of the informal infixes, like the one I talked about earlier. So you might want to check that out if you're interested. And then the last thing I really wanted to talk about was I have some exercises for you to do in tense and aspect. So if you're having problems kind of gripping what they are, then I'd like for you to work on those, and I can put up the answers to them later so you can kind of see if you get them. And if you don't, you can always come and talk to me.